Hello again. I received another response type update from Northumbria Police, Lisa Munro. And I pasted her response into the description. In terms of how I've responded, I'm going to have to do that in stages because it's so evasive what she has written or been told to write. It's unfair to pick on her as an individual. Just a product of a corrupted system, really. So I pasted her response, my response, which I'll go through in this video. I'm going to put in a separate post so you can read that. On the glasses, by the way, before I start, I wear reading glasses and I take them on and off lots of times throughout the day. And I probably should go and get prescription glasses, but the hinges become defective and the arms fall off. So I don't spend a lot of money for them. And when I sort of run down the supplies, I have to take what I can in the local shop. They're quite cheap. So this what I'm wearing now is these the other day. They cost, I think they're pretty cheap. They cost like $1.49. So if I break them, drop them, the arms fall off, it's not such a big problem. But before I delve into their response and how I've responded to their response, I want to continue this journey in literature because it might seem like a diversion, but it's actually ties in a lot of important themes very, very well. And for reference, in the latest videos, I've not used Russian authors to make a political statement. I genuinely have used them for a reason. And the reasons being, if you look at, this is not an exhaustive list. There are others as well. But if you look at Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, they were masters at not only how they psychologically analysed their characters or presented their characters and how they placed them into a social setting and an environment where essentially a country was, the Russian Empire in these particular instances was dying, failing, essentially, and that failure was very, very long-winded. As I've said, I used the example of The Idiot, which is in the 1860s, and Resurrection, which I'll come back to in this video. I think it was 1899. Eventually the Russian Empire fully dissolved in the revolution in 1917. But there were various things that happened before that contributed it, and the strains of World War One finished it off, and the Germans, I guess, in some ways, were a little bit tried to be quite opportunistic in facilitating Lenin's return, and they thought that would help their World War One efforts, because if Lenin established himself and his revolution, then that would take the Russian Empire out of the war, and then the Germans could focus more on the Western Front. But it didn't quite work for them because the Americans had come in on the side of the Allies and countered that. So, but they capture this long period of decline, which if you go back to what I wrote in Lost the Races, and got something else, eventually another book coming out which ties a lot of these things together, but I said that the UK risks being a failing state, and I think it is a failing state, in my opinion. I probably should have been stronger in how I expressed that. But it's not on its own. I think there are other, in particular in Europe, what we call Western countries that are in failing mode. The tricky part is what identifying the catalyst that turns them from failing into failed. That's, and I use the Hemingway example in terms of the bankruptcy. It's the same mechanism, effectively. there's a slow process, something will happen. I would guess it triggers a financial crisis, then the whole thing fails very quickly, would be my perception of what will happen. Or there could be a war, and that generates so much hardship. I hope these things don't happen, by the way, that you get from failing to failed. And I want to go back to, firstly, the Dostoevsky quote, or you probably won't see this in an online version of The Idiot, but in a physical version you will see it. But you can look it up. Yeah, he start of book 3 or part 3. He enters into this sort of essay stroke dialogue about a critique of the practical man in essence, and how conformity effectively aids this decline, this failure, and essentially conformity becomes consent for tyranny that degenerates into failure. And I found a good summary of it, because I haven't got my copy of The Idiot with me. I had to leave it somewhere else, because I'd read from it. But this is a good summary I found, and you can find it via AI or Google, whatever. It says in part 3 of The Idiot, Dostoevsky offers a biting satire of the practical man. The term man can apply in a more universal way now. He was writing in the 19th century in Russia, very sort of patriarchal society at that time, portraying him as a figure who thrives solely through a lack of originality and initiative. Think about your politicians, just trotting out the same narratives, no initiative, no originality, just clipboard narrative, repeat. Look at Burnham yesterday, using completely hollow concepts that meant nothing, almost like Munro's response, of which I pasted in and I'll deal with in this video. Words of nothingness, actions of nothingness, just conformity of a system. The narrator criticizes a society that rewards this conformity and views independent creative thought as a dangerous threat, which is where we are now, because if people challenge things, unpick the narrative like I've done with the FCA, and sort of expose the shortcomings of that model, now we're sort of delving into this child trading model, which is also prevalent in the rape gangs, where you're seeing children traded with private equity owned institutions. Private equity is becoming ever more embedded in the state system, healthcare being one. And you'll see a lot of that because, Burnham was very much involved in that. Despite his socialist exterior, he was very involved in private sector involvement in the NHS when he was a Secretary of State for Health. So it sees that as a dangerous threat, emphasizing the ironic and often tragic costs of achieving such social success. So essentially what he's saying is it's safer to conform. Society rewards this sort of conformity, or you might say acceptance. But it contributes to this process of failure and then this degeneration and ultimate failure. I want to go to this book, Resurrection, now, because there's a few other bits here, and they're worth listening to in relating to what you'll see generally in society. And essentially what this part here I'm going to read to you, I'm trying to think of the best way of describing it. The central character who goes through this process of redemption, so resurrection, it's Nikhailov. He has a debate with a high-ranking official in the Russian government at the time, and he's discussing some of the arbitrary nature of justice and the pointlessness of punishing the people in the way it does. And essentially what the officials trying to defend it, that it's in the interest of society. And the Khalidov leads a meeting, and he sort of says, well, he scoffs at the term, the interests of the people. Your interests, you mean, thought Khalidov as he went out. So he's saying, essentially, it's presented, an oppressive, arbitrary justice system is presented as in the interests of the people, but it's really in the interests of a few people. And there are a few cases he brings up. There's, I don't need to go through those. But he essentially, he said he thought about the sectarians punished for violating orthodoxy, and Gurkovich for wanting constitutional reform, and Khalidov clearly saw that all these people were arrested, locked up, exiled, not really because they infringed justice or behaved unlawfully, but only because they were an obstacle hindering the officials and the rich from enjoying the property they had taken away from the people. So he's saying that, and it's, when you consider it, it's exactly what we're seeing, not necessarily so much on the property side, but a justice system that's being weaponized against people to serve the purposes of a few is in essence what he's doing. And that's exactly what you're seeing in this process of failure, what I've highlighted to you throughout these videos, starting with the FCA and then moving on to other things. Now there's another piece here, and this relates to the practical man critique, if you like, how people, and I saw this in wealth tech, where people behave very differently in a setting, knowing that what they're seeing, what they're choosing not to see, is wrong, and in a different setting, they wouldn't even think about doing that. And very, very relevant to also the rape gang situation, where police, social services and so on knew these things were going on and chose to do nothing, and were sometimes complicit in it, or at least complicit in their choosing not to do something about it. And it's very, very, it's prevalent in many things. But in this particular context, he's following a woman who he wronged in the past, who'd been wrongly jailed as well, trying to extract her from the system and help her rebuild her life. And it follows a scene in prison where prisoners have been sort of cooped up throughout the winter in a confined space, become quite weak, and their bodies have degenerated a bit. And then they're moved to Siberia in the summer. Siberia and Russia, extremely cold in the winter, but very hot in the summer. So very wide range of temperatures. So they have to largely march, leaving Moscow, working towards Siberia, near Moscow, working towards Siberia, and they're marching. They're taking boats, trains, and so on and so forth. But they're going from cooped up cold conditions to baking hot, where they're not used to exercise, and a number of these prisoners died of sunstroke, like to collapse, and there was just a general indifference to that, just a lack of humanity. I mean, particularly some of these prisoners were jailed because it was generally just arbitrary justice, almost like the previous quotes I gave from the same book, when Khalidov is talking to an attorney. He said, well, really, you should look at it as a system where you thank the judge for the generosity of not jailing you. We're now in a system almost where people, because of what they've done with terrorism legislation, online safety, hate speech, and so on and so forth, and harassment, and we're almost in the system now that if it's desired, anybody can be accused of anything. Anybody can, in theory, be a terrorist, for instance. And coupling that arbitrary nature and the inhumane way they were treated, he questions the morality of certain people, stroke the practical man, and so on. So all this comes, thought Nikhalidov, from the fact that all these people, governors, inspectors, police officers, policemen, consider that there are circumstances when human relations are not necessary between human beings. All these men, Maselnikov and the inspector and the convoy officer, if they were not governor, inspector, officer, would have considered 20 times before sending such a mass of people out in such a heat, would have stopped 20 times on the way, and seeing a man growing weak, grasping for breath, would have led him into the shade, would have given him water and let him rest. And if an incident had still occurred, they would have expressed pity. And again, what I'm trying to say to you here is we're in this situation where people are hiding behind, and I'll go back to Munro's response, which is the main purpose of this video. They're hiding behind, people are hiding behind systems that they know are wrong, and they are choosing to look away from outcomes that they can see are horrendous. And I've covered that with the FCA, covered it with my time at Wealth Tech. Well, I didn't work for Wealth Tech, but work with Vertum Asset Management, and now with the rate gang situation, and also this where I've faced police state terror because not only the FCA side have drilled into this because of their own circumstances, drilled into this wicked child trading model with private equity. I've experienced this police state terror because I've challenged how people have chosen to become indifferent to morality and indifferent to outcomes, just to save themselves by saying that they've conformed with the system. So I hope that ties together, and I'll try and come back to some of these themes. Now back on to the response. I'm hoping I can do it, but so I'll say I've done it. If I don't, I'll find a way. But I'm assuming I've been able to paste Munro's response into the description. So I'll review mine, which is only part one of my response, which I will put on a separate post so you can follow that. In the first part of my response, what I've tried to do is say we've lost sight effectively where people who work for in this, be it the public sector, the government, or this shadow sector that has all these sort of quangos and agencies and directives and so on, that sits outside of Parliament. Ultimately, all these things are funded either by clients, in the case of FCA, or the taxpayer in terms of the public sector, and this sometimes people call it a quangocracy. And they lose sight of it. We've almost come to a point where we should feel privileged by being served by people we pay for. And really, when you consider it, it's only really the private sector that pays for it, because the public sector will say they pay taxes, but that's just a redistribution of taxes. They're paid out of a circular system of taxes that have been taken from the private sector. So it's really only the private sector that pays. And this is where really people have got to start to think, because none of these things can happen without the consent of people, and none of these things can happen without people paying for it. Now, of course, there has to be a balance where people give their consent to a government and then comply with that government. But I don't think we've got that at the moment. We haven't had it for a while, where democracy has really just become largely an illusion. And you've seen that again with Burnham. Burnham yesterday gave what essentially was some verbal manifesto that meant nothing in terms of substance, didn't take questions, and essentially will become Prime Minister. Wasn't even an MP at the last election, without any serious scrutiny, without any opportunity to subject him to scrutiny. Even in the Conservative and who were shambolic, they changed their leaders and so on and so forth. But at least those leaders went through some sort of process. Normally, where they had to go through some sort of hustings and so on and so forth. It was a little bit different, I guess, with Sunak, because he had been through some hustings previously when he lost out to Liz Truss. Far from perfect, but this is a complete contempt democracy. And I don't think really we can say that governments really have the consent of the people at the moment. They're really treating people with contempt in terms of pretending it's democracy, and it isn't. It's just really theatre. But people have really got to understand that ultimately the numbers are in their favour. And I'm not talking about violence here. I don't agree with things like that. But people have got to say that we pay for this, and they've got to start to look at how they can organise themselves in a way where they say, no, we don't agree with this, and we won't pay for this unless we're given a properly accountable system, including all these parts that sit outside of Parliament, of which is more and more coming along, that we can be, these people can be properly held accountable. What you'll see with Burnham is this devolution is a real con, because you'll see even more agencies, even more bureaucracies set up, but more locally themed to facilitate this devolution. And it'll be ever more money going to them, to the even more bodies who sit outside of Parliament and parliamentary scrutiny that are receiving money that nobody really can hold accountable for it at all. And Burnham will introduce a whole wave more of that with a local devolution theme. So we really are being conned. And I would say to her, you've sat down and you've issued something. I mean, you read her response. It's just complete nothingness and vagueness and obfuscation. Exactly what we saw from the FCA when people tried to help to hold them to account over Woodford and WealthTech. So I mean, what she said something about emotive language, which is just complete nonsense. I made the point that that's effectively a euphemism for inconvenient language, because a bit like with the FCA, we've drilled into it, we've unpacked it, and when we started to make observations of what we've seen, they said that's emotive language. Standard obfuscation, I guess you would say. And the paragraph where I've addressed her, paragraph number 2, you see that she's sort of trying to obfuscate, talking about a remit and a legal framework and so on and so forth. But she makes no reference to what that is and what, because if she's saying we can't deal with this, we can't deal with that, we can't deal with the other because of this framework, what is this framework? And where in this framework does it say that you can't deal with these specific issues? And that's what I said to her. If you're going to be professional standards, which I don't think they have, you need to be more specific about what you're actually saying you can and can't do, because without doing so, these words are meaningless. So on to where I've addressed paragraph 3. There's quite a bit here. I mean, I did see the rump of her draft before it was sent to me, and I've alluded to that in previous videos. I was a bit sceptical they would send it out in quite the same way, because it really is very, very bad. But they did. But I saw the rump of it and knew broadly how they were going to try to obfuscate and frame it. That's my point in the initial part. But if you think about it, what she's done is exactly, and I made this point in another video, what she's done is she's highlighted the corruption that I've been highlighting. but she's done it without knowing she's really been doing it. And I said that this same corruption is rife throughout the rape gang scandal, or grooming gang, as the government's managed accountability inquiry is terming it. And I said, as you're aware that I suffered police state terror. I was instigated by Northumbria Police in November 2025, as you tried to essentially intimidate me from exposing this corruption in the family court, how this facilitates this child trading model with private equity, and similarly, because I'd spoken about this coordinated coercion with the FCA in terms of how the system of regulation is fundamentally flawed. It's designed like that on purpose to make sure you can never properly hold them to account. And that leads us to a situation where ultimately you have a regulator who's taken to task failed institutions, and the failings of those institutions couldn't have happened without the regulator themselves failing. So these are quite inconvenient things. So it brings police state terror to the door. So, broadly, the police state terror that you'll see, it will either come from terrorism, online safety, harassment, hate speech, all that stuff. They are creating a web of legislation, and there's more coming through, as I said earlier, where anybody can be accused of anything. And if you make the system arbitrary. And also, there's a very important point I want to make about the family court. The family court is a blueprint for why they want to do more of this eradication of trial by jury, because essentially you're making the judge the deity, the god. You're giving them ultimate authority, of which there is no accountability for that authority. And this is what I am identifying here, because what Northumbria Police are saying is these people can operate outside, and this is what I've been telling you, and Munro's confirmed this, they can operate outside the normal framework of the law. The things that apply to us as people don't apply to them. They were allowed to be almost like gods and deities, beyond question. Nobody knows really in a transparent way how they're appointed. Nobody can challenge that. Nobody can hold them accountable. Nobody elects them. And it's a vital part of how this child trading model occurs, because they are the gatekeeper, and you're making the gatekeeper a god, a deity, who's completely unaccountable and wielding enormous power in terms of its impact on people's lives. So that's what I wanted Northumbria Police to do, and they've delivered. So that confirms what I've been telling you throughout. But essentially, the issue is, and this is the trap she fell into, which I knew they were going to, we never asked them to, because they're saying we haven't got the authority to intervene. I just wanted to say that, because it backs up what I just said. But we never asked them to. Now we move from the practical man of following the system to the morality, which I've just shown you, or just highlighted on these quotes, because this is where it brings it in. Because here you've got somebody who's accusing me of harassment, and they use that as a pretext to come in. They added to that some faux, as I've covered. They said I'd vandalised the car. Essentially what had happened is we said we know what you did was immensely corrupt, and I know that our case is not the only one, from her and nationally. These are, because when you give people that much power without any accountability, they become complacent, lazy, greedy, and these things the corruption becomes ingrained and normalised, because they believe there's nothing you can do to stop it. And we sort of said to her, we know this and we're going to expose it, which we are, and there's a long way to go on this. And so what we said to them is, they would have been to her, they would have taken statements from her and listened to her accounts and so on. And they conducted their police state terror. They came in here. They accused me of time machine assisted vandalism. When they come into this property, they knew I'd not vandalised anything, but they used this faux and front of vandalism to be able to take away devices and search this property. Yeah, very similar to what I use the example of George Galloway and Tommy Robinson. These are examples I'm not endorsing, by the way. Did the same to them when they were at airports. Yeah, they stopped them. They were using terrorism fronts for that. They wanted their devices in both cases, so they used terrorism legislation to say, well, we believe you're involved in or want to be engaged in hostile acts and so on and so forth. But strangely enough, if they thought they were effectively terrorists or risk of being a terrorist, you wouldn't really have let them go. But they let them go and they keep the devices. And it's the same concept here. They wanted devices because, I told the FCA, what we'd found in terms of the scale of their catastrophic failings. We told them what we'd found with Woodford. Told them what we'd found with Welltec, and we believed that the whole system was rigged to be in favour of protecting their reputation, prioritising that higher than looking after the victims of the scandals, which only occurred because of their failings, in essence. And we'd started to call out this coordinated coercion where we got threats in the FCA, threats on side council, and so on and so forth. And, then, of course, we get this police state terror. So, these institutions are worried about the research we've done. They wanted to try to look on devices. But ironically, the way I work is I look at the systems, analyse the narrative, so on and so forth, and work with people, and I'm able to say, this is where you'll find what we need. This is where the issues are. So I analyse the systems, see where we'll get where the crucial bits for where we need to look at are, and other people do that. So they would have gone to her and they would have said, well, we've spoken to myself, and my wife wasn't, they terrorised my wife, but she wasn't arrested or anything like that. But she asked to speak to them. And we sort of said, look, speaking about us only, Hudson accepted unsigned, falsified evidence. And that was in the form of what they call, local authority called achieving best evidence. They produced an unsigned statement from our older daughter that she'd never seen, never been signed. I'd gone in all the statements I produced in the case management hearings and so on and so forth. I'd shown how these allegations have been manipulated by Law Appeal, a solicitor working with the child guardian, Kirsty Garcia Leitao, who we'll come to in this case. Donna Grant, the social worker, had also put forward a letter to the judge from our younger daughter that was clearly, it was also unsigned and falsified. I've shown you on the other channel how Jane Poulter lied about this in terms of a response to my wife and all this and so on and so forth. But all these things an experienced judge should have seen and chose not to see. And in essence, what you'd expect is them to go back to her and say, is what they're saying true? That there was unsigned, falsified information submitted in form of evidence. And she was answering truthfully, would say, yes, I didn't see a signed statement. I didn't see a signed letter. And when you're making life-changing decisions, that's extremely alarming. But if you make the judge a deity, a god, the god can do that because the god feels there is no accountability. So even though Northumbria Police wouldn't have been able to intervene in the case, I agree with that because of this deification of the judge. They operate outside the normal parameters of the law, like the FCA do. that, you know, they would be morally obliged to say, okay, this is extremely serious. We're going to have to, you know, let the family court know and just say, look, you know, we believe there's a risk here of serious abuse of public office. And they have chosen not to do that. They've not even come to talk to us about that. They don't even want to talk to us about that. So they are hiding behind the rules, the practical man, and overlooking the morality. Hence, you know, the last thing, you know, would they do that as normal people operating outside of a system, hiding behind a system? They probably wouldn't, because they know what they've seen is horrendously wrong. This is why it may look like diversions when I quote these things, but they're not. And similarly, you know, I've made complaints about threats and coercion that I received from the FCA and South Tyneside Council, effectively blackmailing us that we won't see our young daughter. We stand up for her heritage. They destroyed her Polish heritage. More to come on that. Now, that isn't intervening in the case. That is intervening against heinous acts of abuse against a child, which is effectively, if you look at Rupert Lowe's report, and okay, let's leave the you know, the ethnic and side alone. Other people are taking that on. I understand why they are, but that's not what my remit is here. Read Lowe's report and look at the failings of social services and police, and you'll see the same. The police don't get involved. They don't look. They choose not to see what they should see, and abuses get worse and worse and worse. And our younger daughter, is experiencing immense psychological abuse. She's had her heritage destroyed. She's been passed around like an asset from foster carer to foster carer just to keep this flow going. Yeah, and I've explained to you the model of why that works, but I'm used up quite a bit of time here. So essentially, read through this, and that's what I've tried to do. You know, people are using the system, the rules, the practical man to wade through and choose not to see horrendous abuses. I would contend, in a different context, when I was at WealthTech, well, working with Vertum, part of WealthTech, I was never able to see the client. I didn't put any deals, didn't have access to the client management system, payment system, or anything. But I think people there are playing a double game, experienced, well-qualified professionals, seemingly didn't see the obvious, chose not to see the obvious. Take them out of that environment and say, is that right, what you saw, what you could have perhaps explored a bit more and found out, and tried to work with somebody who had concerns but didn't have access to that system, and what it could have prevented. Is that right? And if you took them outside that system, the rules, the system, where it's far easier to say, well, everyone else thought it was okay and so on, they would probably say, yeah, that's not right. And similarly with the FCA, would Therese Chambers put out the Dick Chambers put out Dick Francis quibs in Do the Right Thing 1. Would they put out these sort of misleading narratives with WealthTech and Woodford, knowing that they failed and these things couldn't have happened without their own failures? Would they do that if they weren't embedded in the system? If they were looking from outside, would they think their actions are right? I don't think they would. This is why I read that quote to you from Tolstoy's Resurrection, and this is why I also have referenced from the same book the dialogue in the other video with the attorney, and that's why I've also quoted the critique of the practical man essay from Dostoevsky's book The Idiot, because they're indicative of a system that's failing, society that's failing. And I'm not calling people degenerate. I'm not calling British people degenerate. I'm calling the systems and the institutions degenerate. I make the distinction there. This is how societies fail. They become more oppressive, more corrupt, more degenerate, and you lead to the eventual failure. That's it for now. Take care.